In 1557, the Spanish Empire controlled 1/4 of the known world and held a monopoly on the silver mines of Potosi that produced more wealth than any treasure in human history. Yet, on June 1st of that year, King Philip II stood before his creditors and declared Spain bankrupt. The empire that ruled the seas, that had conquered the Americas, that funded armies across 3 continents, could no longer pay its debts. This was not a sudden catastrophe. It was stage 6 of a pattern that has repeated across 20 centuries of recorded history. The same pattern destroyed Rome, bankrupted Britain, and collapsed the Soviet Union. Every empire that has ever fallen walked through these same 9 stages in almost identical sequence. The historical record reveals an uncomfortable truth. Economic collapse follows a predictable pattern that transcends culture, technology, and geography. From the Roman denarius to the British pound to the Soviet ruble, the sequence remains consistent. Each empire believed it was different, that its power was eternal, that the old rules no longer applied. They were all wrong. The 9 stages of collapse are not a theory or a model. They are documented facts, extracted from primary sources, treasury records, and the economic data these empires left behind. Stage 1 begins with military overextension. An empire expands its borders beyond its capacity to defend them efficiently. At the height of the Roman Empire in 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, Rome controlled over 5 million square kilometers and maintained borders stretching from Scotland to the Sahara. The cost of defending this territory required constant military deployment, with estimates suggesting defense spending consumed between 50 and 75% of the imperial budget by the late 2nd century. As historian Edward Luttwak documented, the Roman military grew from 300,000 soldiers under Augustus to over 450,000 by the 3rd century, each requiring payment, supplies, and logistical support across impossible distances. Stage 2 manifests as currency debasement to fund military commitments. When tax revenue fails to cover military costs, empires debase their currency. Under Emperor Nero in 64 AD, following the Great Fire of Rome, the silver content of the denarius dropped from 98% to 93.5%. This was just the beginning. By 148 AD, under Antoninus Pius, silver content fell to 83.5%. During the crisis of the 3rd century, between 235 and 284 AD, the denarius collapsed to less than 5% silver content. Each debasement represented an invisible tax, transferring wealth from citizens to the state through inflation. Stage 3 arrives as debt spiral. Debasement fails to solve the underlying problem because expenses continue rising while revenue declines. Habsburg Spain under Philip II demonstrates this pattern with precision. Spain declared bankruptcy in 1557, restructured its debts, then defaulted again in 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, and 1647. Between these defaults, interest rates on Spanish bonds climbed from 5% to over 40%. Despite controlling the silver mines of Potosi that produced an estimated 45,000 tons of silver between 1556 and 1783, Spain remained perpetually insolvent. The treasury spent silver as fast as ships could deliver it, primarily on military campaigns in the Netherlands, Italy, and against the Ottoman Empire. Stage 4 emerges as productive capacity deteriorates. As currency loses value and debt accumulates, the real economy contracts. During Rome's crisis of the 3rd century, archaeological evidence shows urban populations declined by up to 50% in some regions. Trade networks collapsed as merchants refused to accept debased coinage. The Mediterranean shipping routes that had connected the empire atrophied. By 270 AD, provinces like Gaul and Britain were effectively isolated from central authority. Economic historian Peter Tamine estimates that per capita, GDP fell by approximately 25% during this 50-year crisis. Stage 5 shows social fabric disintegration. Economic distress breeds political instability. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome experienced over 50 different emperors, most dying violent deaths within months of taking power. The Praetorian Guard auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder in 193 AD. Provincial armies declared their own emperors. The concept of legitimate succession disappeared entirely. Social trust, the invisible foundation of any functioning economy, evaporated. Citizens hoarded goods, refused to trade across regions, and retreated into subsistence agriculture. Stage 6 brings loss of reserve currency status. This stage represents the point of no return. The British pound sterling held global reserve status from the 1820s through World War I. By 1913, sterling represented approximately 46% of global foreign exchange reserves. After World War I drained the treasury, Britain owed the United States over £4 billion in war debts. The 1925 return to the gold standard at pre-war parity proved disastrous. By the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the dollar replaced sterling as the world's reserve currency. Britain's share of global reserves fell from 40% in 1950 to barely 5% by 1970. The empire that once held 412 million subjects, 23% of the world's population, lost its financial primacy within a single generation. Stage 7 accelerates the collapse. Once reserve currency status disappears, the empire loses its ability to export inflation. Britain had borrowed extensively in sterling, allowing it to service debts with its own currency. After losing reserve status, Britain faced severe balance of payments crises in 1947, 1949, 1967, and 1976. The pound devalued repeatedly. By 1976, Britain required an International Monetary Fund bailout. The Soviet Union followed a parallel trajectory. After Afghanistan drained resources between 1979 and 1989, with estimated costs exceeding 120 billion rubles, the Soviet economy could no longer support its military commitments. Soviet GDP growth fell from 5.2% in the 1960s to essentially zero by 1989. Stage 8 manifests as cascading system failures. Multiple sectors collapse simultaneously. The Soviet Union in 1990 and 1991 exemplified this phase. State-owned enterprises reported losses exceeding 42 billion rubles in 1991. The centrally planned economy, which had allocated resources for decades, simply stopped functioning. Store shelves emptied. Industrial production fell 8% in 1990 and another 11% in 1991. The transportation network deteriorated. Regional governments refused to recognize central authority. The mechanisms that had held the system together for 70 years failed within 18 months. Stage 9 completes the collapse sequence. The final stage varies by empire. Rome's Western Empire fell to Odoacer in 476 AD, though the process began 2 centuries earlier. Habsburg Spain persisted as a secondary power until the War of Spanish Succession in 1714. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 26, 1991. The British Empire gradually devolved into the Commonwealth. The mechanics differ, but each empire reached a point where continuation became impossible. Tax revenue disappeared, military forces could not be paid, and regional authorities declared independence. The collapse, when it finally arrived, seemed sudden to contemporaries, but was merely the visible endpoint of a process decades in development. The crisis of the 3rd century provides the clearest historical example of the 9-stage pattern. After reaching maximum territorial extent under Trajan, Rome entered stage 1. The borders of 117 AD proved indefensible. Persian invasions from the east, Germanic tribes from the north, and internal usurpers created constant military demands. Emperor Septimius Severus allegedly advised his sons on his deathbed in 211 AD to enrich the soldiers and scorn everyone else. Stage 2 began under Nero, but accelerated dramatically after 235 AD. Between 238 and 268 AD, silver content in the Antoninianus, Rome's primary coin, fell from 43% to barely 2%. This was not gradual debasement, but monetary collapse. Citizens refused to accept payment in official currency. The government resorted to payment in kind. Soldiers received land instead of wages. Stage 3 saw inflation rates that modern economists struggle to calculate precisely. The price of wheat in Egypt increased 200-fold between 200 AD and 300 AD based on papyrus records. An army officer's salary that had purchased a year's supply of wheat in 200 AD bought barely 2 months' supply by 270 AD. The empire had entered a debt spiral from which no amount of taxation could provide escape. Stage 4 devastated the productive economy. The plague of Cyprian struck between 249 and 262 AD, killing perhaps 20% of the empire's population. Already weakened trade networks collapsed entirely. Provinces reverted to local subsistence economies. Cities shrank dramatically. The villa economy, Rome's agricultural foundation, deteriorated as owners fled tax collectors. Stage 5 brought political chaos that historians call military anarchy. Emperor Maximinus Thrax reigned from 235 to 238 AD. Emperor Gordian I lasted 22 days. Emperor Gordian II held power for 20 days. The empire fragmented into competing regional powers, including the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. For 2 decades, Rome existed in name only. Stage 6 saw the end of currency as a store of value. Local authorities issued their own coins. Barter replaced monetary exchange in many regions. The Mediterranean trade network that had united the empire for 3 centuries ceased to function as a monetary system. Stages 7, 8, and 9 unfolded between 270 and 284 AD. Emperor Aurelian partially restored order but could not reverse the economic damage. Emperor Diocletian's reforms in 284 AD, including the Edict on Maximum Prices, attempted to control inflation by force. The edict specified maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, prescribing the death penalty for violations. It failed completely within months. The Western Empire survived another 192 years, but never recovered its economic vitality or political unity. The United States in 2024 displays measurable characteristics from stages 1 through 6. This is not speculation, but documented fact. Stage 1 military overextension manifests in force deployments across over 750 overseas military installations in more than 80 countries. The 2024 defense budget exceeded $997 billion, representing approximately 3.7% of GDP. Including veterans benefits, homeland security, and related expenditures, pushes the total above $1.2 trillion, or approximately 4.8% of GDP. For comparison, the United States spends more on defense than the next 9 nations combined. Stage 2, currency debasement appears in Federal Reserve balance sheet expansion. The monetary base, which stood at approximately $800 billion in 2008, expanded to over $5.2 trillion by 2022. This represents a 550% increase in 14 years. The M2 money supply grew from $7.5 trillion in 2008 to over $21 trillion by 2024, a 180% expansion. While not a literal debasement of precious metal content, the effect on purchasing power operates identically to Roman currency debasement. Stage 3. Debt spiral characterizes current fiscal policy. The national debt crossed $35 trillion in 2024. The debt to GDP ratio reached 124%, exceeding levels seen during World War II. Interest payments on the federal debt exceeded $640 billion in fiscal year 2024, consuming approximately 13% of federal revenue. At current trajectories, the Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs will exceed $1.4 trillion by 2034, becoming the single largest federal expenditure. Stage 4. Productive capacity decline appears in manufacturing statistics. Manufacturing comprised 28% of U.S. GDP in 1953. By 2024, manufacturing represented barely 11% of GDP. The United States ran persistent trade deficits, exceeding $700 billion annually throughout the 2010s and 2020s. Labor force participation rates declined from 67.3% in 2000 to 62.5% by 2024. The economy shifted toward service sectors and financial engineering rather than production of tangible goods. Stage 5, social disintegration manifests in declining institutional trust and political polarization. Gallup polling shows confidence in Congress fell from 42% in 1973 to 8% in 2024. Trust in media, educational institutions, and scientific establishments reached historic lows. Political discourse shifted from disagreement over policy to questioning the legitimacy of electoral processes and democratic institutions themselves. These patterns mirror the late Roman Republic's descent into civil war. Stage 6, loss of reserve currency status remains incomplete, but shows early indicators. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves declined from 72% in 2001 to 58% in 2024. This represents the lowest dollar share since 1994. The decline has accelerated since 2020, with an average loss of 1% of global reserve share per year. The BRICS nations, representing over 40% of global population, have announced intentions to trade in local currencies rather than dollars. Saudi Arabia, a key petrodollar partner since 1974, allowed its agreement to price oil exclusively in dollars to expire in 2024. The trajectory is clear. The United States has not yet reached stages 7, 8, or 9, but progression through the earlier stages suggests vulnerability to the same pattern that destroyed previous empires. The question becomes whether recognition of the pattern allows deviation from it, or whether economic forces operate with the same inevitability as physical laws. If the historical pattern holds, stages 7 through 9 unfold with increasing speed once reserve currency loss occurs. Britain lost reserve status at Bretton Woods in 1944 and required IMF assistance by 1976, a 32-year span. The Soviet Union's economic decline accelerated dramatically after 1985, with complete collapse arriving within 6 years. Stage 7 manifests as accelerating inflation combined with economic stagnation. The empire can no longer export its inflation to other nations through reserve currency status. Import costs surge, supply chains fracture, citizens experience rapid erosion of living standards. Political leaders attempt increasingly desperate measures, including price controls, capital controls, and currency restrictions. These measures, as demonstrated by Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, accelerate rather than prevent collapse. Stage 8. Cascading system failures could manifest in multiple simultaneous crises. Financial markets cease functioning properly as counterparty risk makes institutions unwilling to trade. Credit markets freeze. State and local governments default on obligations. The interconnected, just-in-time supply chains that characterize modern economies fail when payment systems break down. Food, fuel, and medicine shortages appear in population centers. The complexity that enabled prosperity becomes a transmission mechanism for failure. Stage 9 varies by historical context, but certain elements appear universal. Regional fragmentation accelerates as local authorities refuse to recognize central government legitimacy. Military forces experience funding disruptions and loyalty questions. Tax collection becomes sporadic or impossible. The mechanisms that held the empire together dissolve within months rather than years. The specific form of American collapse, should it occur, would differ from previous examples. Nuclear weapons, global financial integration, and information technology create variables previous empires never confronted. Yet the fundamental economic dynamics remain identical. No empire in history has maintained reserve currency status after losing fiscal discipline, manufacturing capacity, and social cohesion. The laws of economics do not respect American exceptionalism. The 9-stage collapse pattern reveals a truth that contradicts conventional wisdom. Empires do not fall because of external enemies or moral decay or technological stagnation. They fall because they follow a predictable economic sequence that begins with military overextension and ends in currency collapse. The pattern operates with machine-like precision across cultures separated by millennia. History's most powerful insight remains that every generation believes the old rules no longer apply to them. The Romans believed their empire eternal. The Spanish saw their silver ships as infinite wealth. The British thought the pound sterling would reign forever. The Soviets believed they had discovered the solution to capitalism's contradictions. Each empire possessed unique characteristics that made their situation seem different, special, immune to historical patterns. They were all wrong. The collapse pattern does not care about exceptional circumstances or historical uniqueness. It operates like compound interest or entropy, an impersonal force that grinds empires into dust with mathematical precision. Stage 1 leads to Stage 2 leads to Stage 3. No empire has ever skipped stages. No empire has ever reversed the sequence once the debt spiral begins. The contrarian insight is that recognizing the pattern offers no obvious solution. Once certain stages begin, the structural forces driving collapse may be irreversible. Roman emperors understood the danger of currency debasement, yet continued debasing. British policymakers recognized the threat to sterling, yet could not prevent its fall. Soviet reformers attempted to restructure their economy, yet accelerated its implosion. The knowledge that one stands on a collapsing bridge does not necessarily enable construction of a new bridge before the old one falls. This is the final lesson from 20 centuries of imperial collapse. The 9-stage pattern is not a warning system that allows escape. It is a description of how empires die. The pattern does not exist to be avoided. It exists to be understood. Every empire that has ever existed eventually reached Stage 9. Economic laws operate with the same ruthless consistency as gravity. Whether the American empire proves an exception to this 20th century pattern remains the central economic question of the 21st century. The historical evidence suggests the answer will not support optimism.